There are places on this earth where the law doesn't reach, where the desert sun bakes the sand until it cracks, where the wind carries whispers of violence across empty highways, and where blood soaks into the ground faster than water. The Arizona-Mexico border is one of those places, a line drawn in dust and defended with bullets. And in the early 2000s, one man turned that border into his own personal kingdom of terror. His name was Victor Salazar, though those who feared him called him something else. El Diablo Polvoriento, the Dustborn Devil. Before we descend into the scorching hell that Victor created, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? Are you safe in your home, far from the chaos we're about to explore? Drop a comment below and let me know, because the story you're about to hear is as real as the ground beneath your feet, and it happened closer than you might think. This isn't just another gangster story. This is the tale of a man who believed he was untouchable, who built an empire on suffering, and who learned too late that even devils can burn. So settle in, turn up the volume, and let me take you into the wasteland where Victor Salazar waged his border war. Every devil starts as something else, something smaller, something human. Victor Salazar wasn't born evil, but he was born into circumstances that carved evil into him like words scratched into stone. He came into this world in 1971 in a forgotten village in Sonora, Mexico, where poverty wasn't just a condition but a generational curse. His father was a farmer who couldn't make the dry earth yield anything but dust. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Hermosillo, riding a bus 4 hours each way, returning home with barely enough pesos to feed 5 hungry mouths. Victor was the middle child, invisible between an older brother who worked the failing farm and younger sisters who needed protection in a world that offered them none. He learned early that being invisible meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant being prey. The coyotes that smuggled people across the border would come through his village recruiting mules, young men to carry packages across the desert for a few $100 American. Victor was 13 the first time he made the crossing, his small backpack loaded with cocaine bricks wrapped in plastic and tape, his shoes held together with wire. The desert almost killed him that first time. He ran out of water on the second day, his lips cracking like the earth beneath his feet, his tongue swelling in his mouth until he couldn't swallow. He hallucinated his mother's face in the shimmering heat, heard his sisters calling his name in the wind. But he didn't die. A smuggling crew found him collapsed near a dry riverbed and poured water down his throat, not out of mercy, but because they needed their product delivered. Victor learned something fundamental in that moment of near death. The world doesn't care if you suffer, only if you're useful. He made the crossing 47 more times before his 18th birthday, developing a reputation among the coyotes and cartel scouts as someone reliable. The desert didn't scare him anymore. He knew where the border patrol stationed their trucks, which ranches had cameras, where the underground water caches were hidden. He could read the land like a book written in rock and sand. But more importantly, he learned to read people. He watched how the smugglers operated, how they intimidated their mules, how they negotiated with the American dealers on the other side, how quickly money changed hands and how quickly violence followed when money didn't buy 20. Victor had saved enough to buy his own truck and started running his own crews across the border. He wasn't working for the coyotes anymore. He was competing with them. This didn't go unnoticed. The Sinaloa Cartel, which controlled the trafficking routes through Sonora and into Arizona, sent 2 men to his village to deliver a message. The message was simple: work for us or die. Victor's older brother, who had nothing to do with the smuggling business, was beaten unconscious in front of their mother's house as punctuation to the threat most men would have bent the knee. Victor Salazar wasn't most men. Instead of submitting, he went to the rivals. The Juarez cartel was trying to muscle into Sinaloa territory, and they needed local operators who knew the routes and had the nerve to challenge the established order. Victor walked into a warehouse in Ciudad Juarez with nothing but audacity and a proposal. Give him guns, give him product, and he'd open a new corridor through Arizona that Sinaloa didn't control. The Juarez bosses saw something in his eyes that day, something cold and certain. They gave him his chance. The war started small. A few shipments intercepted. A Sinaloa stash house in Tucson raided and burned. A smuggler found with his throat cut in the desert as a warning. But Victor understood what the cartel bosses sometimes forgot. This wasn't just about drugs and money. This was about fear. You didn't control territory by being the richest or the best connected. You controlled it by being the most willing to do what others wouldn't. By making your name synonymous with consequences. He started leaving bodies in public places, staging them in ways that told stories. A corrupt Border Patrol agent who'd been taking bribes from Sinaloa was found hanging from a highway overpass near Nogales. His uniform stripped off, the word traitor carved into his chest. A rival smuggler was crucified on a billboard outside Douglas, left to die in the sun as traffic passed below. These weren't just murders, they were theater. They were Victor's way of announcing that someone new had arrived, someone who wouldn't play by the old rules. The media started picking up on the violence. Local news stations in Tucson and Phoenix ran stories about the escalating cartel violence along the border, always careful to frame it as a Mexican problem bleeding over into America. They didn't understand yet that the violence wasn't spilling over. It was being cultivated, weaponized, and directed by someone who saw the border not as a line between countries, but as a frontier waiting to be conquered. Law enforcement agencies started seeing patterns in the killings, a signature of brutality that seemed designed to send messages they couldn't quite decode. By 2003, Victor Salazar controlled a 30-mile stretch of the Arizona-Mexico border between Nogales and Sase. He'd built a network of scouts, mules, enforcers, and corrupt officials on both sides of the line. His crews ran cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana through the desert in quantities that flooded the streets of Phoenix, Tucson, and beyond. The Juarez cartel was making millions from his operation, and Victor was taking his cut, growing wealthy beyond anything his younger self could have imagined. He bought his mother a house in Hermosillo, set his sisters up with businesses, paid for his brother's medical bills. But wealth wasn't what drove him anymore. What drove Victor Salazar was power, the intoxicating knowledge that he could make decisions that altered reality for thousands of people, that he could choose who lived and who died, who got rich and who got buried in the desert. He'd gone from being invisible to being inescapable. People whispered his name in the cantinas of Sonora and the dive bars of southern Arizona. They told stories that grew with each telling. How he'd walked into a border patrol station and walked out with classified information. How he'd killed 5 men with his bare hands. How he could disappear into the desert like a ghost. Most of the stories weren't true, but Victor understood something crucial about power. Perception matters more than reality. If people believed he was a devil, if they feared him like a force of nature, then he didn't need to prove it with every action. The reputation did the work for him. He encouraged the mythology, never correcting the exaggerations, sometimes adding details himself when he heard the stories retold. El Diablo Polvoriento became less a man and more a legend, something larger than human, something elemental and unstoppable. But legends attract attention, and attention brings enemies. Sinaloa hadn't forgotten the upstart who challenged them. The DEA had opened a file with his name on it. The FBI's El Paso Intelligence Center was tracking his movements. And within his own organization, there were those who saw his growing fame as a liability, a spotlight that would eventually burn them all. Victor Salazar had become exactly what he'd set out to be, too big to ignore. And in the world he'd chosen, being too big to ignore meant being too big to let live. The sun was setting on the Sonoran desert, as Victor stood on a hilltop overlooking the border fence, that pathetic barrier of steel and wire that pretended to separate two worlds. He could see the lights of Nogales, Arizona flickering to life as darkness fell. Could imagine the drugs flowing through the tunnels his crews had dug, the money changing hands, the addiction spreading like a disease through American suburbs. He'd built all of this from nothing, from hunger and desperation and the willingness to become what others feared. What he couldn't see from that hilltop was the storm gathering around him, the forces aligning against him, the betrayals being planned, the trap being set. Victor Salazar believed he was untouchable, that he'd become something more than human through sheer force of will and violence. But the desert has a way of humbling everyone eventually, of reducing empires to dust and legends to bones. His war was just beginning, and wars, by their nature, consume those who wage them. The Dustborn Devil was about to learn that every hell has a deeper circle, and every devil meets someone more ruthless eventually. By 2005, Victor Salazar's operation had evolved from a smuggling network into something resembling a shadow government. He controlled not just the drug routes, but the entire ecosystem that made the border his personal fiefdom. His empire stretched from the Sierra Madre Mountains deep in Sonora all the way to the distribution hubs in Phoenix, a supply chain built on corruption, violence, and an almost supernatural ability to stay ahead of law enforcement. The infrastructure Victor built was sophisticated in ways that would have impressed legitimate businessmen. He employed dozens of scouts on both sides of the border, locals who knew every ravine, every ranch, every forgotten road. They communicated using encrypted radios and a coded language that changed weekly, making intercepts useless to authorities. He purchased night vision equipment from corrupt American military suppliers, GPS devices that tracked every mule and every shipment, and vehicles modified with hidden compartments engineered by former automotive mechanics who'd been recruited with a simple choice: work for us or watch your family suffer. But the genius of Victor's operation wasn't just technological, it was psychological. He understood that controlling territory meant controlling the people who lived on it. In the small towns along the border on both the Mexican and American sides, Victor became a figure of contradictory legend. To some, he was a benefactor. He funded schools in Sonoran villages, paid for medical supplies when the government wouldn't, threw lavish celebrations during holidays where he distributed food, toys, and cash to families who had nothing. Children wore shoes he bought. Churches received donations that kept their doors open. Local businesses got loans that banks wouldn't provide. This generosity bought him something more valuable than affection: silence. When federal agents came asking questions, no one had seen anything. When Border Patrol tried to recruit informants, they found no one willing to talk. Victor had weaponized poverty, turning desperation into loyalty, or at least into the appearance of loyalty. People didn't love him necessarily, but they feared what life would be like without him. And fear dressed up as gratitude is nearly as effective as the real thing. On the American side, his strategy was different but equally effective. He identified the weak points in the system: the underpaid Border Patrol agents drowning in student debt, the small-town cops who supplemented their salaries with construction work, the county officials whose campaigns ran on donations they couldn't quite account for. Victor didn't approach these people with threats initially. He approached them with understanding. A few $1,000s to help with a daughter's medical bills, a job for a nephew who couldn't find work, an envelope of cash that appeared in a mailbox at just the right time, no questions asked, no strings apparently attached. The strings came later, of course. Once someone accepted that first payment, they were compromised. The next request would be small: ignore a certain vehicle at a checkpoint, provide a copy of a patrol schedule, look the other way when a shipment moved through. Then the requests would grow larger, and by then, refusing meant exposing themselves to prosecution. Victor had turned law enforcement officers into accomplices, not through intimidation but through incremental corruption, boiling the frogs slowly until they didn't realize they were drowning. By this point, Victor's network was moving an estimated $200 million worth of drugs annually through his corridor. The money flowed like a river, and like any river, it carved channels through everything in its path. He bought ranches in southern Arizona that served as staging areas for shipments. He purchased legitimate businesses, auto repair shops, restaurants, construction companies, that laundered money and provided cover for his operations. He even invested in real estate in Phoenix and Tucson, becoming a landlord to families who had no idea their rent money was flowing back into the drug trade. But with success came paranoia. Victor knew that the larger his empire grew, the more vulnerable it became. He began to see threats everywhere, real and imagined. He employed a personal security team of former Mexican Special Forces soldiers, men who'd been trained by Americans and then recruited by cartels offering 10 times their government salaries. They swept his properties for listening devices, varied his routes, kept him moving between safe houses that were scattered across Sonora. He trusted no one completely, not even his closest associates. This paranoia was justified. The DEA had indeed been building a case against him since 2003, collecting evidence from wiretaps, surveillance, and a slowly growing list of informants. The FBI had assigned a task force specifically to dismantling his network. And within the Juarez cartel, there were whispers that Victor had become too independent, too visible, too much of a liability. He was making more money than some of the bosses. And in the cartel world, that kind of success bred envy and suspicion. The first serious attempt on his life came in April 2005. Victor was staying at a ranch outside of Canania when a hit squad of 6 men entered the property at 3 in the morning. They were professionals, former military, armed with suppressed weapons and night vision gear. They should have succeeded, but Victor's paranoia had saved him. He never slept in the master bedroom of any property, always choosing a different room, sometimes not sleeping at all, just sitting in darkness with a gun in his lap, waiting for threats that might never come. That night, the threat came. He heard the whisper of suppressed gunfire and the screams of his guards, and he moved like the desert predator he'd become. He killed 2 of the hit squad himself, putting bullets in their heads at close range in the darkened hallways of the ranch house. His security team eliminated the others. By sunrise, 6 bodies were burning in a pit on the property, and Victor was interrogating the 1 man they'd taken alive. The man confessed through broken teeth that Sinaloa had sent them, that the price on Victor's head was now $500,000. Victor didn't escalate immediately. Instead, he played a longer game. He sent a message to the Sinaloa bosses through intermediaries. He wanted peace, a negotiated settlement, a recognition of territories, and a cessation of hostilities. The message was calculated to make him seem reasonable, even weak. The Sinaloa leadership, interpreting this as fear, agreed to a meeting. The meeting was held at a warehouse in Caborca, neutral territory overseen by mediators from the Tijuana cartel. 3 Sinaloa representatives came to negotiate, expecting to dictate terms to a chastened Victor Salazar. Instead, they walked into a carefully orchestrated execution. The mediators had been bribed. The neutral territory was a killing floor. Victor had the 3 men bound and gagged, and then he did something that cemented his reputation for calculated cruelty. He didn't kill them quickly. He kept them alive for 3 days, torturing them in ways designed to send a message that would echo through the cartel world. When their bodies were finally discovered, dumped on a road leading into Culiacan, Sinaloa's stronghold, they'd been mutilated so severely that identification required dental records. Carved into their backs was Victor's new message to anyone who challenged him. El Diablo Polvoriento no negocia. The Dustborn Devil does not negotiate. This wasn't strategy anymore. This was ego. Victor had begun to believe his own legend, to think of himself as truly untouchable. His lieutenants noticed the change in him. He took more risks, made more public appearances. started traveling with smaller security details because he believed his reputation alone would protect him. He gave interviews to journalists, anonymous, his face obscured but still, in which he portrayed himself as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from corrupt systems to help the poor. The truth was far darker. The money he distributed to poor communities was a fraction of what he kept. The violence he unleashed killed more innocents than he ever helped. His drugs destroyed families across the American Southwest, creating addicts who lost everything, children who grew up without parents, communities that rotted from the inside out. Victor told himself he was just meeting demand, that if he didn't supply the drugs, someone else would. It was the oldest justification in the world, and it was no less hollow coming from him than from any other predator who built wealth on human suffering. But in his private moments, did Victor ever feel guilt? Did he ever think about the 13-year-old boy who'd almost died in the desert, desperate and afraid? His mother claimed he visited her often, that he was a good son who sent money and showed respect. His sisters said he was protective, loving even, especially toward their children. How do you reconcile the man who bought school supplies for his nephews with the man who tortured enemies for days? How do you hold both truths in your mind at once? Maybe you can't. Maybe Victor couldn't either. Maybe that's why he threw himself deeper into the role of El Diablo Polvoriento, becoming the character so completely that the real Victor Salazar, whoever that had been, disappeared entirely. The desert had claimed him after all, not by killing him but by burning away everything human until only the predator remained. By late 2005, Victor's empire was at its peak. He controlled more territory, moved more product, and wielded more power than at any point in his career. He'd survived assassination attempts, evaded capture, and defeated rivals who should have destroyed him. From where he stood, surveying his kingdom of dust and blood, it must have seemed like he really was untouchable, like he really had transcended the limitations of ordinary men. But empires built on blood have weak foundations. The higher you build them, the harder they fall. And gravity, eventually, comes for everyone. Every predator eventually encounters a predator hunting them. For Victor Salazar, that hunter came in the form of an organization, not an individual, but within that organization was a man who would become his nemesis. Special Agent Marcus Reeves of the DEA wasn't looking for glory or revenge. He was looking for justice, and he'd been looking for Victor Salazar specifically since 2004. Reeves was different from the usual federal agents who rotated through the border assignments before transferring to more prestigious posts in New York or Miami. He'd grown up in southern Texas, spoke fluent Spanish, and understood the cultural complexities that outsiders missed. More importantly, he understood that catching someone like Victor required thinking like him, anticipating his moves, getting inside his psychology. You couldn't just chase Victor Salazar. You had to make him come to you. The task force Reeves assembled was small but specialized. He recruited analysts who could track financial patterns, surveillance experts who knew the desert terrain, and a translator who could decode the constantly changing slang and coded language Victor's organization used. But Reeves's most valuable asset was an informant, someone inside Victor's network who'd grown disillusioned with the escalating violence and the man Victor had become. The informant's name was Mateo Cruz, and he'd been with Victor since the early days. Mateo had been a mule when Victor was still just another smuggler, had risen through the organization as Victor's empire expanded, and had become one of his trusted lieutenants. But Mateo had a daughter, 8 years old, who was the center of his world. And one day, Mateo realized that the drugs he was helping move across the border were killing people just like his daughter, children whose parents couldn't function, families torn apart, futures destroyed. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Reeves flipped Mateo carefully over months of conversations, offering not just protection but a way out, a chance to stop the machine from inside. Mateo provided information slowly at first, testing whether Reeves could be trusted. But as the relationship developed, the intelligence became more detailed. Shipment schedules, routes, stash house locations, and most importantly, Victor's patterns and vulnerabilities. The first major bust came in February 2006. A shipment of 600 kilograms of cocaine, worth millions on the street, was intercepted before it even crossed the border. Victor's scouts had spotted the law enforcement presence and aborted, but the loss was significant. Then in March, a stash house in Tucson was raided, resulting in the seizure of $2 million in cash and the arrest of 3 of Victor's distributors. In April, another shipment was caught, this time with 7 mules arrested and facing federal charges. Victor knew someone inside his organization was talking. Paranoia, which had always simmered beneath his surface, now reached a boiling point. He ordered background checks on everyone in his inner circle, had people followed, phones tapped, lives investigated. His meetings became interrogations. His questions became accusations. The atmosphere within his organization shifted from loyalty enforced through respect to loyalty enforced through terror. He started making examples. A logistics coordinator who'd made a minor mistake in accounting was tortured and killed as a suspected informant, even though there was no evidence. A driver who showed up late to a delivery was executed on suspicion alone. Victor's enforcers became executioners, and the body count rose. But the busts kept happening. The task force kept intercepting shipments. The pressure kept building. Reeves was patient. He knew that pushing too hard too fast would either get Mateo killed or cause Victor to go to ground completely. Instead, he orchestrated a campaign of systematic dismantling, targeting the infrastructure of Victor's empire piece by piece. They arrested corrupt border patrol agents, flipped them, used their testimony to prosecute others. They seized properties, froze bank accounts, created legal tangles that made it harder for Victor's money to move through legitimate channels. The Juarez cartel bosses were getting nervous. Victor's corridor, which had been their most profitable route, was now their biggest liability. Every bust made the news. Every arrest drew more federal attention. The cartel leadership began to question whether Victor was worth the heat he was bringing down on them. Quietly, they started making contingency plans that didn't include El Diablo Polvoriento. Victor sensed the shift. He could feel the ground eroding beneath him. His calls to cartel leadership weren't returned as quickly. His requests for additional resources were met with delays and excuses. He was being isolated, cut off from the support system that had enabled his rise. And isolation in the cartel world was often a prelude to elimination. In June 2006, Victor made a decision that showed how desperate he'd become. He ordered a direct attack on law enforcement. A border patrol station near Lukeville was hit with automatic weapons fire, bullets tearing through vehicles and office windows. No agents were killed, but several were injured, and the message was clear. Victor was pushing back, trying to reassert dominance through violence. The attack was a catastrophic mistake. It transformed the situation from a law enforcement operation into a matter of national security. Resources that hadn't been available before suddenly materialized. The ATF, FBI, and even military intelligence assets were redirected toward capturing Victor Salazar. Politicians from Arizona demanded action. News media ran wall-to-wall coverage of the terrorist attack on American soil. Victor had gone from being a criminal to being a symbol, something that demanded a public response. Reeves knew this was the moment. Victor was off balance, making emotional decisions instead of calculated ones, trusting the wrong people because he no longer knew who to trust. The task force intensified their operations. They began tracking Victor's movements in real time through a combination of surveillance, informant intelligence, and phone intercepts. They mapped his network of safe houses, identified his security protocols, learned his habits. By August, they had enough intelligence to plan a capture operation. But there was a problem. Victor had largely stayed on the Mexican side of the border, and the Mexican government, while publicly cooperative, was slow-walking any real action against him. Corruption ran deep, and some officials were on Victor's payroll. An arrest warrant existed, but executing it would require coordination and political will that seemed unlikely to materialize. So Reeves decided to bring Victor to American soil. They leaked false information through a channel they knew would reach Victor. Information about a massive shipment of weapons being held at a ranch near Patagonia, Arizona. The weapons supposedly belonged to a rival organization, and whoever captured them would have a significant advantage in the ongoing border wars. The bait was designed to appeal to Victor's ego and his strategic thinking, a chance to arm his forces and humiliate a rival simultaneously. Victor took the bait. He couldn't help himself. The combination of tactical advantage and symbolic victory was too tempting. He began planning a raid on the ranch, gathering a force of 20 men, arranging for vehicles and weapons, coordinating timing. But he made another critical error. He decided to lead the raid himself. The old Victor, the careful strategist, would never have taken such a personal risk. But the new Victor, the one who believed his legend, thought his presence would inspire his men and send a message to his enemies. Mateo reported everything to Reeves. The date, the time, the route Victor would take, the size of his force. The task force had weeks to prepare, to transform the trap from a crude ambush into a sophisticated capture operation, involving multiple agencies and contingency plans for every possible scenario. They would have FBI hostage rescue teams, Border Patrol tactical units, DEA agents, and even helicopters with thermal imaging. The goal wasn't just to arrest Victor, but to dismantle his entire organization in one operation by capturing him and his top lieutenants simultaneously. August 23, 2006, started like any other day in the Sonoran Desert, hot, cloudless, and deceptively peaceful. Victor crossed the border in a convoy of 4 vehicles, armed men in each, confident that his scouts had cleared the path and that the weapons waiting at the ranch would shift the balance of power back in his favor. He had no idea that every move he made was being watched, that the weapons didn't exist, that the ranch was a stage set for his capture. As his convoy approached the ranch in the late afternoon, Victor must have felt invincible. He'd evaded capture for years, survived assassination attempts, built an empire from nothing. The desert that had nearly killed him as a boy now belonged to him. El Diablo Polvoriento was in his element, moving through his kingdom. Then the desert exploded with violence. Law enforcement vehicles appeared from behind berms and buildings. Helicopters roared overhead. Commands to surrender echoed across the landscape. Victor's men opened fire immediately, and the task force returned fire with overwhelming force. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, but in that time, the myth of Victor Salazar's invincibility shattered like glass. 3 of his men were killed in the initial exchange. 5 more were wounded and captured immediately. The rest, including Victor, tried to run on foot into the desert, but there was nowhere to run. The helicopters tracked them with thermal imaging. Ground units closed in from multiple directions. The trap tightened with mechanical precision. Victor made it less than half a mile before he was tackled by federal agents and forced to the ground. His face pressed into the same dust he'd claimed to rule. When they pulled him to his feet, hands zip-tied behind his back, Victor Salazar looked small somehow, diminished. The desert sun beat down on him as cameras captured his arrest, the footage that would play on news channels across the world. El Diablo Polvoriento had been caught. The Dustborn Devil was just a man after all, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, surrounded by the rubble of his collapsed empire. Marcus Reeves watched from a distance, as Victor was loaded into an armored vehicle. He felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed and the knowledge that the violence wouldn't stop, that someone else would rise to fill the vacuum Victor left behind. The war never ended. It just changed participants. For Victor, the moment must have been surreal, almost dreamlike. Everything he'd built, everyone he'd been, reduced to this. Handcuffs and cameras and federal agents reading him his rights in English and Spanish. The boy who'd survived the desert, who'd become a legend, who'd made himself into something larger than life, was now just another prisoner being transported to a cell. The empire of dust had collapsed, and its emperor was falling. The legal machinery of the American justice system ground into motion with the full weight of federal authority behind it. Victor Salazar was transferred to a high-security facility in Florence, Arizona, held without bail, and charged with a catalog of crimes that read like a greatest hits of narcoterrorism, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, money laundering, firearms trafficking, conspiracy to murder federal officers, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. If convicted on all counts, he faced multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. The case against him was designated as one of the highest priority prosecutions in the country. The United States Attorney for the District of Arizona personally took lead on the trial, assembling a team of prosecutors who specialized in complex cartel cases. They had years of evidence, dozens of witnesses, financial records that traced millions of dollars in drug proceeds, intercepted communications, and testimony from cooperating defendants. They also had Mateo Cruz, whose insider knowledge would be devastating on the witness stand. Victor's defense team was formidable as well. The Juarez Cartel, hoping to prevent him from cooperating with authorities, provided funding for a legal dream team led by Richard Castellano, a legendary criminal defense attorney from Los Angeles known for his ability to create reasonable doubt, even in seemingly airtight cases. Castellano's strategy was clear from the beginning. Attack the credibility of cooperating witnesses, suggest that Victor was being scapegoated for crimes committed by others, and paint him as a small player in a much larger criminal network who was being prosecuted primarily for symbolic reasons. The trial began in March 2007 in federal court in Tucson. Security was unprecedented. Bomb-sniffing dogs, metal detectors, armed marshals throughout the courthouse. The jury's identities kept confidential for their protection. The courtroom itself was packed with reporters, federal agents, victims' family members, and observers from multiple law enforcement agencies. This wasn't just a trial. It was a spectacle, a public exorcism of the violence that had plagued the border for years. Victor himself appeared transformed from the dust-covered prisoner captured in the desert. Dressed in an expensive suit, clean-shaven, his hair neatly cut, he looked more like a businessman than a cartel enforcer. His attorneys had coached him on courtroom demeanor. No emotional displays, minimal reactions, an expression of calm attentiveness. The goal was to present him as intelligent and reasonable, someone who didn't match the monster the prosecution was describing. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. They walked the jury through Victor's rise from small-time smuggler to major cartel operator, detailing the violence he'd orchestrated, the lives destroyed by his drugs, the corruption he'd spread through law enforcement. They showed photos of crime scenes, victims, seized drugs and weapons. They presented evidence of his organization's sophistication, the radios, the vehicles, the infrastructure. They traced money from street-level deals in Phoenix all the way back to Victor's accounts in Mexican banks. The portrait they painted was of a ruthless, calculating criminal who turned murder into a business strategy. But it was the witness testimony that truly brought the case to life. Agent Marcus Reeves testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the investigation, explaining how they'd tracked Victor's movements, intercepted his communications, and ultimately captured him. Reeves's testimony was careful and methodical, never overstating the evidence, letting the facts speak for themselves. Under cross-examination, Castellano tried to suggest that the entire operation had been improper, that evidence had been obtained through illegal means, that the trap set for Victor constituted entrapment. Reeves remained calm, systematically refuting each suggestion with documentation and procedure. Then came the cooperating witnesses, former members of Victor's organization who'd taken plea deals in exchange for their testimony. They described murders they'd witnessed or participated in. They detailed how Victor gave orders, how he decided who lived and died, how he reacted when things went wrong. Some testified from behind screens, their identities protected, their voices altered, because even with Victor in custody, they feared retribution from his loyalists still operating in Mexico. The most compelling testimony came from survivors of Victor's violence. A woman whose husband, a low-level dealer, had been tortured and killed when Victor suspected him of skimming money. A border patrol agent who'd been shot during the Lukeville attack, who described the terror of bullets tearing through his vehicle. A mother whose son had died of an overdose from heroin that investigators had traced back to Victor's network. These weren't abstractions or statistics. They were human beings whose lives had been shattered, and their testimony brought the cost of Victor's empire into sharp focus. Then it was Mateo Cruz's turn. His testimony was scheduled to last 2 days, and the anticipation in the courtroom was palpable. Mateo had been the one closest to Victor, the one with the most detailed knowledge of his operations. Under direct examination by the prosecution, Mateo described how he'd met Victor, how the organization had grown, how decisions were made. He testified about specific murders, describing Victor's involvement in planning and execution. He detailed the corruption network, naming names of officials who'd been bribed. He discussed the drug trafficking operations in granular detail, routes, quantities, distribution methods. But what made Mateo's testimony truly damaging was his description of Victor's psychology. He talked about how Victor had changed over the years, how the power had consumed him, how he'd become increasingly paranoid and violent. Mateo described conversations where Victor had casually discussed killing people who disrespected him or failed him. He recounted moments of cruelty that went beyond business necessity, acts of violence that seemed motivated by ego or entertainment rather than strategy. Under cross-examination, Castellano went after Mateo aggressively. He highlighted Mateo's own criminal history, his participation in murders and drug trafficking. He suggested Mateo was testifying to reduce his own sentence, that he was fabricating or exaggerating Victor's involvement to please prosecutors. He pointed out inconsistencies in Mateo's various statements to investigators. For hours, he hammered at Mateo's credibility, trying to portray him as a liar and opportunist. But Mateo held firm. He admitted his crimes without minimizing them. He acknowledged his motivations for cooperating, but maintained that his testimony was truthful. When Castellano asked why the jury should believe a murderer and drug trafficker, Mateo gave an answer that seemed to resonate. Because I was there. Because I did these things with him. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to lie about it either. You want to know who Victor Salazar really is? I can tell you because I stood next to him for years. The defense's case was shorter. Castellano called character witnesses who testified about Victor's generosity, his support for his family and community. They portrayed him as a product of poverty and desperation, someone who'd made bad choices, but wasn't the monster the prosecution described. The defense couldn't really contest the evidence of drug trafficking, but tried to suggest that Victor was a mid-level operator who was being portrayed as more important than he actually was. Victor himself did not testify. Castellano advised against it, knowing that prosecutors would destroy him under cross-examination, that his history of violence couldn't be explained away. So the jury never heard Victor's voice, never got his version of events directly. He remained silent, expressionless, watching as his life was dissected and debated by strangers. The closing argument stretched over 2 days. The prosecution emphasized the overwhelming evidence, the credibility of their witnesses, the pattern of violence and criminality that defined Victor's career. They asked the jury to see past the expensive suit and calm demeanor to the man who'd built an empire on human suffering. They reminded the jury of the victims, the destroyed families, the corrupted officials, the violence that had turned the border into a war zone. Castellano, in his closing, made a passionate argument that the government was using Victor as a symbol, prosecuting him not for what he'd actually done, but for what he represented. He questioned the credibility of cooperating witnesses who were saving themselves by testifying against Victor. He suggested that reasonable doubt existed about Victor's role in many of the specific crimes charged. He reminded the jury that even people accused of terrible things deserved fair trials based on evidence, not emotion. The jury deliberated for 6 days. The length of deliberation suggested they were taking their responsibility seriously, carefully reviewing the evidence, debating the charges. Inside the deliberation room, jurors later reported, there was never serious doubt about Victor's guilt on the major charges. The evidence was too overwhelming. The debate was about lesser charges where the evidence was circumstantial, about whether specific murders could be definitively linked to Victor's orders, about the degree of his involvement in certain operations. On March 28, 2007, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood and began reading. Guilty on conspiracy to distribute narcotics. Guilty on operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Guilty on money laundering. Guilty on firearms trafficking. Guilty on conspiracy to murder federal officers. The list went on, conviction after conviction, count after count. When it was finished, Victor Salazar had been found guilty on 32 of 34 charges. Victor's expression never changed. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the defense table, as if he were listening to someone read a weather report rather than a verdict that would end his life as a free man. Only his eyes moved, briefly meeting those of his mother sitting in the gallery, her face streaked with tears, before returning to the judge. The victims' families wept. Federal agents allowed themselves small smiles of satisfaction. Reporters rushed to file updates. In Mexico, in the towns and villages where Victor had once been feared and respected, people heard the news and calculated what it meant for them. Would someone rise to take his place? Would the violence increase or decrease? Would the money keep flowing or dry up? Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later. Under federal guidelines, Victor faced mandatory life sentences on multiple counts. But before sentencing, something unexpected happened. Victor's attorneys approached prosecutors with an offer. Victor was willing to cooperate, to provide information about the Juarez cartel's operations, in exchange for a reduced sentence. This was the moment the cartel had feared. Victor knew everything: the identities of high-ranking members, the locations of assets, the details of operations throughout Mexico and the United States. If he talked, he could bring down significant portions of the organization, but cooperation would also mark him as a traitor, a death sentence that would follow him into whatever prison he was sent to. Cooperating witnesses had to be held in special protective custody units, isolated from general population, living in a kind of prison within prison. The negotiations stretched on for weeks. Prosecutors wanted information on specific individuals and operations. Victor's attorneys wanted guarantees about his sentence reduction and his safety. In the end, Victor decided not to cooperate. Whether this was out of loyalty, fear, or some twisted sense of honor, no one could say for certain. He would serve his time rather than betray the organization. The sentencing hearing in June 2007 was brief. The judge, having reviewed the evidence and the conviction, sentenced Victor Salazar to 8 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He would be transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where he would spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement in a 7-by-12-foot concrete cell. As marshals led him from the courtroom for the last time, Victor looked small despite his height, diminished by the weight of forever. The boy who'd crossed the desert 47 times, who'd built an empire, who'd made himself into a legend, would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, alone with his memories and his choices. El Diablo Polvoriento had been judged, convicted, and sentenced. The trial was over, but the story somehow was not. ADX Florence is designed to be inescapable, both physically and psychologically. Built into the Colorado foothills, the Supermax facility houses America's most dangerous federal prisoners, terrorists, mass murderers, cartel leaders, and those who'd proven violent even in other prisons. The cells are designed for absolute control and isolation. Soundproof walls, furniture made of poured concrete, windows positioned so inmates can't see anything but sky, deliberately preventing any sense of where they are or what's around them. Every meal delivered through a slot. No human contact except with guards, and even that is minimal. Victor Salazar arrived at ADX Florence in August 2007, processed and cataloged like every other prisoner, stripped of everything that had made him El Diablo Polvoriento. No reputation mattered here. No legend, no power, no connections. Just a number, a cell, and the crushing weight of permanent isolation. He was assigned to Unit H, which housed cartel leaders and organized crime figures, men who'd once wielded power over thousands but now couldn't control anything, not even when the lights in their cells turned on or off. The first weeks were reportedly the hardest. Victor had spent his life in motion, crossing deserts, building networks, staying ahead of enemies and law enforcement. Suddenly, he had nowhere to go, nothing to build, no one to command. The cell was 7 feet wide and 12 feet long, 4 paces in any direction. That was his world now, forever. Other prisoners broke in those first weeks, screaming at walls, beating their heads against concrete, spiraling into psychosis. Victor remained silent. Guards who monitored him reported that he exercised methodically, did push-ups and squats in his tiny space, maintained a rigid routine. He ate what was given to him without complaint. He followed every instruction immediately. On the surface, he seemed to be adapting. But adaptation to ADX Florence isn't really adaptation. It's survival through shutdown, and the mental and emotional costs accumulate regardless. The isolation was total. Victor could go weeks without hearing a voice other than guards giving commands. Conversations, when they happened, were shouted through walls to inmates in neighboring cells. Disembodied voices discussing nothing of consequence because everything was monitored. Some inmates broke the silence by singing, others by talking to themselves, constructing elaborate internal dialogues that kept some connection to the social world alive, even if it was imaginary. Victor started reading. The prison library system allowed inmates to request books, and he devoured them. History, philosophy, novels, biographies. He taught himself English properly, moving beyond the street Spanish and broken English he'd used in his criminal career to something more sophisticated. He read about Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, other men who'd built empires and watched them collapse. Did he see himself in those stories? Did he search for meaning in the arc of his own rise and fall? His family visited occasionally, though the visiting process at ADX Florence was another form of torture. Visitors and inmates never touched, never occupied the same room. They communicated through phones and thick glass, watching each other on video screens, connections mediated by technology and concrete. His mother came twice a year until she died in 2011, growing older and frailer with each visit. Her son preserved in his concrete tomb while she aged toward death. His sisters visited sporadically, their lives moving forward while his remained frozen. But something strange happened as the years passed. Victor Salazar became, in his own way, institutionalized, not broken, but transformed into something adapted to captivity. The man who'd thrived on power and freedom, now built a life within constraints that would drive most people insane. He became a legal scholar of sorts, studying his case law, filing appeals that went nowhere, corresponding with other inmates about legal strategies. He maintained his physical fitness with obsessive dedication. He kept a mental calendar, tracking days that blurred together into an endless present. And he wrote. ADX Florence allowed inmates limited writing privileges, and Victor filled notebooks with what guards described as memoir-like material. Whether he was recording his life, trying to justify his choices, or simply maintaining sanity through narrative creation, no one knew. The notebooks were monitored but never published, locked away in prison records, another artifact of a life lived at extremes. Outside the walls, the world moved on. The Juarez cartel continued operating without him, though the power vacuum his removal created contributed to escalating violence in Ciudad Juarez that would turn the city into one of the world's murder capitals between 2008 and 2012. New players emerged. The routes Victor once controlled were fought over, claimed, lost, and reclaimed in cycles of violence that made his era seem almost quaint by comparison. The border war continued, just with different soldiers. Agent Marcus Reeves retired from the DEA in 2015, his career defined in many ways by the Victor Salazar case. In interviews, he spoke about the capture with professional satisfaction but no joy. He understood that arresting Victor hadn't solved anything fundamental. It had removed one player from a game that would continue indefinitely. Driven by American demand for drugs and economic desperation in Mexico, the system persisted regardless of who went to prison. Mateo Cruz, the informant whose testimony had been crucial to Victor's conviction, disappeared into the witness protection program. His daughter grew up under a new name in a new city, hopefully free from the shadow of her father's past. Whether Mateo found peace or just a different kind of isolation in his protected life, no one knows. He became a ghost, present in court transcripts and evidence files but absent from the living world. In the communities where Victor had once been a figure of fear and perverse respect, memory proved short. Younger generations didn't know his name. The stories about El Diablo Polvoriento became the kind of legend old men told in cantinas, exaggerated with each telling until the real man was lost beneath layers of mythology. Someone else's corrido played in those same cantinas now, celebrating a new generation of criminals who thought they were different, who believed they were smarter, who didn't yet realize they were following the same trajectory toward the same end. By 2015, Victor Salazar had been in ADX Florence for 8 years. In prison time, that's an eternity. In life sentence time, it's nothing, a fraction of the forever he was facing. The man who'd been 35 at sentencing was now 43, still relatively young, facing decades more of the same concrete cell, the same isolation, the same routine of controlled existence. What does that do to a mind? How do you maintain identity when everything that defined you has been stripped away? Some inmates at ADX Florence reported that Victor had become religious, though whether this represented genuine faith or just another adaptation strategy was unclear. In a place where you control nothing, where every aspect of your existence is determined by others, perhaps turning to a higher power is the only way to maintain some sense of agency, even if it's imaginary, or perhaps facing the absolute limits of your mortality and the consequences of your choices drives people towards spiritual reckoning. Both can be true simultaneously. What's documented is that Victor never caused problems. No assaults on guards, no violations of prison rules, no disciplinary actions. He was a model prisoner, which at ADX Florence means someone who'd completely surrendered to the reality of their captivity. The fire that had driven him to build an empire had either been extinguished or transformed into something cold and banked, burning so low it was nearly invisible. Did he regret his choices? Did he think about the people killed by his drugs, the families destroyed, the corruption he'd spread like a disease? In letters to his sisters that were monitored and recorded, he wrote about his mother, about wishing he'd made different choices, about hoping his story would serve as a warning to younger relatives. But these letters were written with the knowledge that authorities would read them, so their sincerity is impossible to gauge. People perform remorse without feeling it all the time, and sometimes genuine remorse gets performed so often it becomes hollow. Or maybe the question of remorse is too simple for someone like Victor Salazar. Maybe he existed in the gray space where you can simultaneously acknowledge the harm you've caused and still feel justified by the circumstances that shaped you, where you can mourn the people you hurt while still believing you had no real choice, where you can wish things had been different while maintaining that, given who you were and where you came from, you did the only thing possible. The complexity is that Victor was both victim and victimizer. He grew up in poverty that was itself a form of violence, in a system that offered limited paths out of desperation. The choices he made were constrained by circumstances he didn't create. But he also chose violence when other options existed. He chose to build his power through terror. He chose to believe his own legend and the myth of invincibility. At some point, circumstances become excuses, and accountability becomes unavoidable. Inside that 7-by 12-foot cell, with decades left to contemplate these questions, Victor Salazar had all the time in the world to work through the moral arithmetic of his life. Whether he ever reached conclusions or just circled endlessly through justifications and regrets, the world outside would never know. He'd become irrelevant except as a cautionary tale, a name in case files and sentencing guidelines, a reminder that even the most powerful criminals eventually face walls they can't escape. The empire of dust had become a cell of concrete. The Dustborn Devil had been reduced to a prisoner counting days that all looked the same. And somewhere in Colorado, in a box designed to contain the worst of humanity, what remained of Victor Salazar continued existing, breathing, remembering, trapped in the aftermath of his choices. The story of Victor Salazar didn't end with his imprisonment. It metastasized. In the vacuum his arrest created, violence along the Arizona-Mexico border intensified rather than decreased. A reminder that the problem was never one man, but the entire corrupt system he'd operated within. The drug trade, that perpetual machine of supply and demand, couldn't care less about individual personalities. It adapts, evolves, finds new channels like water flowing around obstacles. The Juarez Cartel, which had sponsored Victor's rise, fragmented in the late 2000s as internal leadership battles coincided with pressure from rival cartels and law enforcement. Ciudad Juarez descended into chaos, recording over 3,000 murders in 2010 alone. Women disappeared from the streets. Bodies appeared in public places bearing signs of torture so extreme that local media refused to publish details. The violence became a humanitarian crisis, creating waves of refugees fleeing north, seeking asylum in the very country whose drug appetite had fueled the carnage. The routes Victor had controlled became the most contested real estate in the drug trafficking world. Sinaloa pushed back into Arizona with overwhelming force. Los Zetas, a new breed of cartel built from former military special forces, moved into border areas with tactics that made Victor's methods seem restrained by comparison. They brought military discipline to criminal enterprise, using encrypted communications, drones for surveillance, and violence calibrated not just to intimidate, but to terrorize entire populations into submission. Tucson and Phoenix, the cities where Victor's drugs had once flooded the streets, struggled with their own aftermath. Addiction rates that had climbed during his operational years didn't fall after his arrest. They plateaued, sustained by new suppliers who filled the market gap within months. Treatment centers were overwhelmed. Families already devastated by addiction continued their struggles, the removal of one distributor making no difference in their personal catastrophes. Law enforcement agencies celebrated the Salazar conviction as a major victory, and in purely prosecutorial terms, it was. They built an ironclad case, secured cooperation from insiders, and removed a significant criminal actor from operation. Agent Reeves received commendations. The task force model was replicated in other jurisdictions. The case became a teaching example in federal law enforcement training programs, studied for its effective use of intelligence gathering and patient investigation. But honest agents, the ones willing to speak off the record, admitted that the victory felt hollow. They'd cut off one head of a hydra that immediately grew two more. The fundamental drivers of border violence, American drug demand, Mexican poverty and corruption, the billions of dollars that made criminal enterprise irresistible to desperate people, remained untouched. Victor Salazar's removal had changed the names and faces, but not the underlying reality. In academic circles, Victor became a case study in the sociology of organized crime. Criminologists wrote papers analyzing how he'd built loyalty through a combination of brutality and beneficence. Economists mapped his distribution networks and calculated the market efficiencies of his operation. Psychologists theorized about the mental processes that allowed someone to order murders while maintaining family relationships. He was dissected intellectually, reduced to data points and theoretical models, his humanity lost in the academic abstraction. The media treatment was more sensational, but no less reductive. Netflix announced plans for a documentary series about border cartels that prominently featured Victor's story. Journalists wrote books with lurid titles like Devil in the Desert and Blood and Dust, the Victor Salazar story. The coverage focused on the most dramatic elements, the violence, the money, the manhunt, while glossing over the systemic issues that created people like Victor in the first place. He became entertainment, his life packaged for consumption by audiences safely distant from the consequences of the drug trade. In the communities where Victor had operated, the response was more complex. Some people genuinely mourned him, remembering the money he'd distributed, the schools he'd funded, the jobs his operations had created. They conveniently forgot or compartmentalized the violence, focusing on what he'd provided in an environment where the government provided nothing. Others celebrated his imprisonment, glad to be free from the atmosphere of fear his presence had created, hoping that his removal might bring some peace. But the most honest assessment came from those who simply shrugged, people who understood that Victor was a symptom, not the disease, and that his absence changed nothing fundamental about their lives. The poverty remained. The lack of opportunities remained. The attraction of quick money from illegal activity remained. Young men still looked at the narco lifestyle and saw it as their best or only option for escaping the circumstances they were born into. In Mexican popular culture, Victor became a legend, his story absorbed into the narco corrido tradition that celebrates and romanticizes drug traffickers. Corridos are narrative ballads that function as unofficial histories, telling stories the official culture ignores or suppresses. Several bands wrote songs about El Diablo Polvoriento, portraying him as a brave warrior fighting against impossible odds, conveniently editing out the torture, the corruption, the innocent victims. The corridos made him into a folk hero, a modern Robin Hood, perpetuating the mythology that feeds the next generation of aspiring criminals. His family struggled with his legacy in different ways. His mother, before her death, maintained that her son was a good man who'd made bad choices, a position mothers often take because the alternative, acknowledging that your child became a monster, is psychologically unbearable. His sisters tried to live normal lives under the shadow of their brother's infamy, their children growing up with a surname that carried weight they didn't ask for. Some relatives changed their names. Others moved away from the border region entirely, trying to escape the association. The victims of Victor's operation had no such ambiguity. For them, he represented unambiguous evil, the source of drugs that killed their loved ones, the architect of violence that destroyed their sense of security, the symbol of a system that valued profit over human life. Support groups for families affected by border violence included people whose lives had been directly impacted by Victor's decisions. They welcomed his life sentence as justice, but also recognized it as incomplete. He was in prison, but their loved ones were still dead, their families still broken. In ADX Florence, Victor likely had little awareness of how his story was being told and retold in the outside world. The extreme isolation of Supermax's incarceration meant minimal news access, no internet, no real connection to public discourse about his case. He existed in a kind of temporal stasis, frozen at the moment of his capture, while the world moved on without him. Whether this was mercy or additional punishment is a question each person must answer for themselves. By 2020, Victor had been imprisoned for 13 years. He was approaching 50 years old, still facing life sentences that meant he would die in ADX Florence, barring some unforeseeable change in circumstances. Appeals had gone nowhere. The evidence against him was too strong, the convictions too clean, the sentences too clearly within guidelines. There was no legal path out. No presidential pardon was coming for someone like him. His story, from a legal perspective, was finished. But stories never really finish. They just fade into other narratives, become pieces of larger patterns, turn into warnings or inspirations depending on who's listening. Victor Salazar's life had become a text that people read different ways based on their own perspectives and needs. To law enforcement, he was proof that even the most sophisticated criminals could be caught. To aspiring traffickers, he was a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. To academics, he was a data point in theories about organized crime. To his family, he remained a complicated person who'd done terrible things but was still their blood. The real legacy of Victor Salazar wasn't his empire, which collapsed the moment he was captured. It wasn't his reputation, which was always more mythology than truth. It was the system he operated within which continued unchanged. The border remained a war zone. The drugs kept flowing north. The money kept flowing south. Different names, same game, a cycle as perpetual as the desert seasons. And somewhere in that cycle, right now, there's probably a kid in some forgotten Mexican village making his first crossing, carrying a backpack full of drugs, convinced he's different from all the others who came before, believing that he's smart enough or tough enough or lucky enough to avoid the fate that consumed men like Victor Salazar. That kid doesn't know he's already repeating a story that's been told 1,000 times, that ends the same way, in prison, or dead in the desert, or corrupted beyond recognition into something that destroys everything it touches. That's the real legacy. Not the man, but the machine that creates men like him over and over, an assembly line of tragedy disguised as opportunity. Victor Salazar was unique in his details but utterly typical in his arc. The border war didn't start with him, and it didn't end with him. It just continues, grinding up new lives every year, while politicians make speeches. Law enforcement makes arrests, and nothing fundamental changes. The dust settles over the desert, covering the blood until the next wind exposes it again. To understand Victor Salazar completely is to understand something uncomfortable about human nature and the systems we've created. This isn't a story with clear heroes and villains, though it's tempting to frame it that way. It's a story about structural violence, about how poverty and opportunity intersect to create monsters, about how every choice narrows future choices until you're trapped on a path that feels inevitable even though it wasn't predestined. Think about that 13-year-old boy in the desert, dying of thirst, carrying cocaine for people who didn't care if he lived or died. What were his options? Return to a village with no prospects, watch his family starve slowly, accept poverty as his permanent condition, or cross that desert, survive, make money, give his family some relief from the grinding desperation that defined their existence. The choice seems obvious when framed that way. The tragedy is that the choice was real. The system had failed so completely that criminal enterprise became a rational option for a child. But here's where the empathy gets complicated. Understanding how Victor became what he became doesn't excuse what he did. The structural violence that shaped him doesn't erase the violence he inflicted on others. He made choices, over and over, to build his power through brutality. He could have stopped at any point. He could have taken his money and walked away. He could have said no to the escalating demands from the cartels. He didn't because by then, he'd become addicted not to drugs but to power, to the identity of El Diablo Polvoriento, to the legend he'd created for himself. That's the other uncomfortable truth this story reveals. Being a victim of systemic violence doesn't prevent you from perpetuating it. Victor experienced poverty, desperation, and limited options, all forms of violence inflicted by economic and political systems. But he responded by creating his own system of violence, arguably worse than what he experienced. He reproduced the power dynamics that had oppressed him, just with himself at the top instead of the bottom. The cycle continued, just with different people suffering. The question that haunts this story is whether it had to end this way. Could Victor have chosen differently at crucial moments? When the Sinaloa cartel came to recruit him, could he have refused and survived? When he started working for Juarez, could he have built an operation that didn't rely on torture and murder? When he achieved success, could he have transitioned to legitimate business rather than escalating the violence? The answer is probably yes. There were off-ramps, moments where different choices would have led to different outcomes. But each choice constrained the next, narrowing his options until the path to prison or death became the only real possibility. Law enforcement, for all its celebration of the Salazar conviction, should also reflect uncomfortably. They caught him, yes, but what did they really accomplish? The drug trade continued. The violence continued. New operators filled the vacuum. The fundamental problems, American drug demand, the economic desperation in Mexico, the corruption that enables trafficking, remained unaddressed. The system prosecutes individuals while leaving the structural causes intact, guaranteeing that the next Victor Salazar is already out there, already making the same choices, already starting down the same path. And American society bears responsibility that it rarely acknowledges. Every person who bought cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine from Victor's network participated in the system that made his empire possible. Every political leader who campaigned on being tough on drugs, while ignoring treatment and education, contributed to the demand that fuels trafficking. Every policy that prioritized punishment over addressing root causes helped create the conditions that produce people like Victor. The blood on his hands doesn't wash clean, but there's plenty of blood to go around. The communities along the border live with the consequences of all these failures. They're caught between cartels that see them as resources to be exploited and governments that see them as problems to be managed. They watch their children face the same impossible choices Victor faced, knowing that some will make the same decisions, perpetuating cycles that seem unbreakable. They bury their dead and try to maintain normal lives in circumstances that are anything but normal, resilient in ways that people in safer places can barely comprehend. For Victor himself, locked in his cell in Colorado, what remains? Memory, regret, justification, all tangled together in whatever psychological framework he's built to survive permanent isolation. Does he think about the people killed by his drugs? Or has he compartmentalized that away as not his responsibility, just meeting demand that existed regardless? Does he replay crucial decisions, imagining what different choices might have meant? Or has he accepted his past as unchangeable and focused on surviving the present? The truth is probably all of these, simultaneously, contradictory thoughts coexisting in a mind that has decades left to circle through them. The philosophical question at the heart of this story is about determinism and agency. How much choice did Victor really have? If you're born into poverty in a place with no legitimate opportunities, if the culture around you glorifies narco success, if the economic system makes crime rational and legitimate work unsustainable, how much agency do you really possess? And even if your choices are heavily constrained, Do you still bear moral responsibility for the harm you cause? Most ethical frameworks would say yes, that constrained choices are still choices, that understanding causes doesn't eliminate accountability, but understanding causes should influence how we respond. Punishing individuals without addressing systems is like bailing water from a sinking ship without fixing the hole. It's necessary but insufficient. The war on drugs has incarcerated millions, spent trillions, and failed by every metric except the perpetuation of law enforcement budgets and prison populations. The Victor Salazar prosecution was technically successful but strategically meaningless. The next day, the drug trade continued as if he'd never existed. What would meaningful change look like? Probably addressing American drug demand through treatment rather than incarceration, creating economic opportunities in Mexico and Central America that provide alternatives to trafficking, ending the prohibition that makes drugs profitable enough to justify violence, addressing corruption on both sides of the border. These solutions are complex, expensive, and politically difficult, which is why they're rarely attempted. It's easier to celebrate arresting one man than to acknowledge that the problem requires fundamental systemic change. Victor Salazar's story should make us uncomfortable because it reveals how our choices, our policies, and our consumption patterns create the conditions that produce people like him. He's not an aberration. He's a logical outcome of the systems we've created. And until we're willing to acknowledge our complicity and change those systems, there will always be another kid in the desert, carrying drugs across the border, taking the first steps toward becoming the next devil. The sun rises over Arizona and Sonora every morning, indifferent to borders, illuminating the same desert where Victor Salazar nearly died as a boy and where he later built his empire. That desert continues to swallow people, migrants seeking better lives, smugglers caught in cartel wars, addicts whose bodies are found months or years after they die. The dust covers them all equally, making no distinctions between victims and perpetrators, between those trying to survive and those trying to dominate. Somewhere in that desert right now, someone is making the choices that will define their life, that will determine whether they survive or fail, whether they become predator or prey, whether their name becomes a legend or a statistic. The machine that created Victor Salazar keeps running, grinding people up, offering impossible choices and calling them opportunities. And we watch from a distance, tell ourselves stories about good and evil, heroes and monsters, while avoiding the harder truth that we're all part of the system that makes these tragedies inevitable. El Diablo Polvoriento was real, but he was also a symbol, a manifestation of larger forces that preceded him and will outlast him. His story ends in a cell, but the story itself continues, repeating with variations, new names and faces acting out the same fundamental dynamics. Until we change the underlying systems, this will keep happening. The border will keep being a war zone. The drugs will keep flowing. The violence will keep escalating. And somewhere, another devil will be born from desperation, shaped by circumstances, making choices that seem rational in the moment but lead inevitably toward destruction. That's the legacy we should take from Victor Salazar's life. Not just his individual story, but what it reveals about the world we've created. A world where being born in the wrong place at the wrong time can set you on a path toward becoming something monstrous. Where systems fail so completely that crime becomes rational. Where violence perpetuates violence across generations. Where justice punishes individuals while leaving the structural causes intact. Victor Salazar is in prison for the rest of his life, and the desert continues without him, creating new devils as reliably as the sun creates heat. Until we acknowledge that truth and commit to real change, his story will just be one chapter in an endless book of border violence. Each chapter different in its details but identical in its trajectory. Toward dust, toward prison, toward death, toward the grinding machinery of a system that consumes everyone it touches.